Welcome to Shifting Ground, the podcast of the Orbis Journal of World Affairs, brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Join us every other week as our editors connect the pages of Orbis with the issues of the day.
I'm Nick Gvosdev, a professor at the Naval War College and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
And I'm Larry Rubin, an associate professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology.
Together, we serve as editors of Orbis, the Journal of World Affairs.
Each episode will speak with scholars, policymakers, and practitioners about the forces reshaping global politics, international security, and world affairs.
You can find this and future episodes of Shifting Ground on our website, orbisjournal.org, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major streaming services. Please note that the views expressed by the hosts and participants in this episode are their own. This is Shifting Ground.
Today, we're joined by Dmitri Alperovitch to discuss U.S.-China competition, Ukraine war, technology and strategy, deterrence, and some of the broader geopolitical questions shaping international politics today. Dmitri's chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, the co-founder of CrowdStrike, and author of World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. He also hosts the Geopolitics Decanted podcast. Dmitri, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.
So before we jump into the questions, what we really like to do is to ask a few questions about you. How did you get here? How did we invite you to this podcast, and what do you do?
Well, I don't know how we got here. Thank you for inviting me. So great to be with you. But I'm a Georgia Tech alum, which I think had something to do with why I'm here. And I went into Georgia Tech with a focus on first computer science and then a graduate school. That emerging field of cybersecurity was then called information security, but really developed a passion for international affairs very early on, even before tech, but expanded on it at tech and took a lot of courses in our Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the time. And after graduation, went headlong into the field of cybersecurity and technology, figuring that I would never use that part of my knowledge again. But sure enough, about 7 years later, my two worlds of cyber international affairs collided yet again. And with the emergence of nation-state threat actors like China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, they were hacking into companies or hacking into governments to advance their economic and geopolitical strategic interests. And I was in the middle of many of those investigations. There was one that I named called Operation Aurora, which was a hack of Google and many other companies back in 2010. There was sort of a groundbreaking thing when we first realized that China was engaging in this massive economic espionage against the West on a hereto unprecedented level. I was part of the investigation to the Saudi Aramco hack by Iran back in 2012 and hack of Sony by North Korea in 2014 and many, many other things. So realized early on that we don't really, as I coined it at the time, we don't really have a cyber problem. We have a Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea problem, and became once again passionate about geostrategy and geopolitics, asking the question of why are these nations doing this in cyber and what else are they doing outside of cyber? And in the world of cyber, I co-founded this little company called CrowdStrike that is now over $100 billion market cap company. But once we took it public and I retired from it, I focused on geopolitics full time. And for the last 6+ years, have been running Silverado Policy Accelerator, which is a geopolitics focused think tank. And in the course of that, have the grim distinction of being 3 for 3 on war predictions, having been very early on predicting that Russia would invade Ukraine about 3 months before that war broke out. In January of last year, predicted that there would be a war between Israel and Iran, which of course took place in June, and then the most recent war between the United States and Iran as well. I'm hoping I'm going to be wrong on my fourth prediction, which is in the book about the coming conflict with China. I think we can still avoid it, but things are not looking great there right now.
One thing I'd like to tease out a bit more is your notion of kind of combining these two worlds together, that for many years, as I was coming up through the IR space, tech was always something separate and was often seen as the realm of non-state actors or people on the fringe, or it was asymmetry. It was just something that the serious, quote unquote, serious people in international affairs were focusing on hard power and economic power, and cyber was just off to the side. And yet, what we've seen over what you've described, kind of as you've gotten involved in all of this, is that in fact cyber is not peripheral; it's at the heart and center. Can you give us a sense, as you said, we don't have a cyber problem, we have a China problem, a Russia problem, an Iran problem, a North Korea problem. Realizing that each of those countries we could spend days and weeks discussing. Can you just give us an overall sense among the CRINC, if that's the term we can use, of how they have chosen to instrumentalize cyber power and how the states have taken cyber power? Because again, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, the sense was is that cyber was the tool of the anarchist, the revolutionary, the non-state actor. And yet we have four highly centralized states, authoritarian states, that seem to have really mastered, so to speak, the cyber instrument of power. So is there something, and are there lessons for us to learn from that?
Well, look, these four states are certainly not the only ones with active cyber offense programs. In fact, there are over 100 different countries now at various stages of developing cyber offense. But I actually found this really interesting, right? That, 15 years ago, looking at the developments of cyber across the whole world, why is it that time and time again, as we investigated breaches into government networks, into private sector networks, it was China, Russia, Iran, North Korea? And it's because these are our geopolitical threat actors, right? Guess what? Singapore is really, really good at cyber. I don't spend my time worrying much about what cyber Singapore is going to do to the United States, right? For a reason, because we have, a fairly friendly relationship. We have norms of behavior that we abide by, and we don't target each other's economies and do things that are detrimental to each other's interests. That's true of most countries around the world, except the four that we're in this strategic confrontation with, right? And I'll tell you, cyber is one of those things that is a canary in the coal mine, I think, that it often gives you a sense for adversary intentions, because cyber is the first tool that they will pull out of their toolkit to use, because it's kind of covert, it's deniable, right? Even when you get attributed, you can sort of reject the attribution and claim it wasn't you, and is perceived as having very, very little cost to it, and probably rightly in terms of usage. So these countries would often use cyber early on, and if you're following what they're doing, you can interpret their intentions. So I got convinced over 15 years ago that we were in a Cold War with China long before most people were even paying attention to China, still during the pro-engagement era under Obama and Bush beforehand. But I'm looking at what they're doing in cyber, and they're ripping us blind. They're stealing everything that's not bolted down. They're giving it to the commercial industry and state-owned enterprises to compete against us. They're stealing our national security secrets. They're stealing information about our weapons programs and trying to build equivalent or trying to build weapons systems that can defeat ours. And I'm asking, why are they doing that? I thought we were friends. I thought this was like, China is liberalizing any second now and is going to become another Jeffersonian democracy. And that doesn't seem to be, all that compatible with that vision, right? And at the time, I was shocked that the government was completely ignoring it and dismissing it. I remember in 2011, right after I did another big investigations into Chinese breaches, highlighting the extensiveness of it and being convinced that this was happening literally everywhere. At the time, I coined this phrase that you may have heard of, that there are two types of companies: those that know that they've been hacked and those that don't yet know, because I was realizing it was happening literally everywhere. And I was asked to come into the White House. I was in the Situation Room and briefing the national security staff on the latest investigation, and getting very animated towards the end of it, because I felt like they were just taking notes and saying, "Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks for coming and briefing us." And almost like Khrushchev wanted to bang on the table of like, "You guys are not appreciating this. Is an economic war we're in. We got to do something about it." And the senior person at the head of the table said, "Oh, Dmitri, you're so naive. As long as they keep stealing, they can't innovate." And I'm looking at that and I'm saying, are you kidding me? First of all, this is so ahistoric. And of course, over the last 15 years, that's proven exactly wrong, because China is now the leading innovator in so many fields, whether it's electric vehicles, batteries, solar, telecom, you name it. A lot of it built initially on the culture of theft and massive IP that they've stolen, but then they continue to innovate beyond it. And theft always helps you steal. And, having the background of being born in Russia and being a student of the first Cold War with the Soviet Union, I, of course, knew that was complete nonsense because, even if you look at the example of the Manhattan Project, right, the Soviets infiltrated it and stole the secrets, which helped them get to the atomic bomb in 4 years in 1949. And but they get to the hydrogen bomb all on their own with Sakharov and others in the Soviet Union, of course, developing the designs independently for the hydrogen bomb. So not only did stealing not stop their innovations, it accelerated it. And there are numerous examples, even with us. You look at our space program. A lot of it was based on research from Germany, from Nazi Germany, including the head of the program that we took to start basically the precursor to NASA, and Werner von Braun. And then, of course, we evolved and got to the moon first in the space race. But, it didn't hurt us that we stole all this research from Germany. Stole is probably the wrong word. We captured it in the war. But point is, that was completely historical and, of course, wrong. But no one was paying attention to what was happening. And they were still thinking of, we can't rock the boat. We want to be pro-engagement. In 2015, right, 4 years later, you had President Obama standing next to President Xi in the Rose Garden and saying, "We welcome China's rise." Remarkable statement that 11 years later, you wouldn't hear anyone in this town, Democrat or Republican, even dare to utter. But, just a short time ago, that was the prevailing wisdom. And, you look at Russia, what they've done in cyber, obviously messing with our political system, also engaging in a lot of sabotage operations all over Europe, obviously in Ukraine before the conflict, Iran doing both as well, theft and sabotage. North Koreans being absolutely brilliant at raising money for the regime that's going directly into their nuclear and missile weapons programs. So cyber becomes an essential element of extending their power in the physical realm, and often giving us insights into what their broader intentions are. And by the way, it was one of the things that I was looking at the time of back in December of 2021, 3 months before the war, what Russia was doing in Ukraine in cyberspace, and saying, wait a second, this looks very different from what they've done in the past, even to Ukraine. This seems like preparation of the battlefield. Put it all together with the huge military mobilization that they're undertaking, the statements from Putin and others, the papers that they've written about Ukraine not being really a nation state, an independent country, and combined with lots of other things, I became convinced very early on that this war was going to happen.
This is absolutely fascinating. Actually, you can take it in a lot of different directions. But one of them I wanted to touch on a little bit more is really about your, I guess, predictions in that sense, or seeing all of the factors that may lead to war. And one of them that you've highlighted is having to do with what a state's use of cyber tools tells you about their intentions in that way. And so I wanted to, is that one of the kind of categories you think about or look at when you say, okay, we may or may not see a war between these two actors? And what are some of the other ones?
Yeah, I'll give you an example with China, right? I'm convinced that China is preparing for conflict and military conflict with the United States over Taiwan. And one of the things, there are numerous things that make me convinced of that, but one of the things is what they're doing in cyber. So about now 5 years ago, 6 years ago or so, they started this campaign, right? So for decades now, they've been infiltrating virtually every network that had anything valuable and stealing that IP. About 6 years ago, they started doing something very different. They started infiltrating networks that had nothing worth valuable to steal. Think water utilities, pipelines, electric utilities, that there's no IP in there, just, operational networks. And they're infiltrating them, and then they do nothing. They just lie there and wait. And the U.S. intelligence community believes they're doing this to prepare the battlefield so that they can cause immense disruption and destruction to our critical infrastructure in the event of conflict, or even in advance of conflict, to prevent our mobilization to the Pacific in order to deter or actually fight a war with them, because they're also hitting military targets and military adjacent targets like port facilities, right? So you look at that and you say, they're putting enormous effort into a campaign that is giving them no value, right? They're not extracting any economic benefit from this whatsoever. And by the way, you find them, you kick them out, they come back in. So like a lot of effort that's been put in this, clearly it's been done for something. Clearly there's a strategic reason behind this. And by the way, this has been raised to them at the highest levels. President Biden in the last administration raised it directly to Xi. It hasn't had any effect. So they're willing to take a political cost to continue doing this. There's got to be a reason for it. And the reason is that they're preparing for war with us. right? And we need to be paying attention to that.
You spoke about so far you're 3 for 3 on predictions. And as we now think about this fourth prediction, I assume that you don't take a fatalist view that, well, there's nothing we can
No.
do, it's inevitable. So, what would be some of your recommendations? Obviously, the president meeting with the president of China and just saying, knock it off, is not a strategy. Saying, stop this because we asked you nicely. So, what would be some of the steps you would recommend to say, how do we keep your record at 3 out of 4 so that
Yeah.
we don't go to 4 to 4?
Yeah, and the fourth one is the one that really matters, right? So I desperately hope we can avoid it. Look, I started writing this book specifically to outline the strategy literally on February 24th, 2022, because looking at the war in Ukraine, even though I was completely convinced it was going to happen, I actually thought it would happen either that very week or maybe even the weekend before when Zelensky was at Munich Security Conference. I thought that was a great time to launch a war. Putin decided to delay it by a few days. But even though I was completely certain of it, it was still a shock to the system, right? When you believe in something sort of theoretically, but then it happens, you're like, oh my God, this is actually happening. Remember that night of Wednesday night, US time, the war began early Thursday morning, of course. I was talking to people on the ground in Ukraine, hearing and seeing the videos of the initial missile strikes and bombing raids and so forth, and being just like thinking, oh my God, this actually happened. And then thinking that morning about why we ended up where we ended up, and what I thought were the causes of the conflict and why Putin was motivated to do it, I realized that it was completely transferable, one-to-one, to the situation in the Pacific with Xi Jinping. But with Xi Jinping, we have a lot more time, right? I became convinced that the war was going to happen in December of 21. By that point, I think the stage was set. I don't think there was anything we could have done to stop it. But with Xi, we have years. I don't think that the war is going to take place before probably 2030s, early 2030s, and that's not a huge amount of time, but that's years for us to deter that. And I don't think it's set in stone. I don't think he's penciled a date in the calendar for invasion. I think he would like to get away with taking Taiwan without war if he can, like every dictator and authoritarian leader. Clausewitz once said, quoting Napoleon, that every aggressor is peaceful and that they would like to take over their neighbors unopposed. Neither Putin nor Xi are an exception to that, but war is always the last resort. But in terms of what we can do, so first of all, obviously military deterrence is key to this. We have to dissuade China of the notion that they can easily do this militarily. There is a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot that we are already doing in beefing up our military presence in the region, in Guam and Mariana Islands, in Japan and the Philippines, making sure that China knows that outcome is not certain here, and that they can suffer a very humiliating, disastrous defeat. And two, for deterrence to be effective, you need both capability and will, right? And demonstratable will. And they need to understand that Taiwan matters enough to us that we would potentially go to war with them. I don't think we should abandon our strategy of ambiguity with regards to Taiwan, but we we should try to ensure to China that we would likely privately go to war with them over Taiwan, to make sure that they don't think that we will self-deter ourselves, right? The last thing we want is for them to think the United States will never fight a war with us. Let's go, because lone Taiwanese really probably wouldn't be capable of defending themselves. Unfortunately, they should be, but they're not. There's more that we need to do there as well, but realistically, in the next, call it 4 years, 6 years, this is going to be up to us largely. And convincing them that we have both the capability to defeat them and the will is really, really important. And as part of that will equation is an economic component where we have to make sure that they don't hold this sort of Damocles over us with rare earths, with pharmaceutical precursors, with semiconductors, all the things that we're so reliant on their production for, that can decimate our economy. So doing much more on achieving what President Putin would call import substitution, what China has been engaged in for decades, reducing their vulnerabilities in terms of dependence on the Western supply chains. We need to rapidly do that ourselves with regards to China, and try to, as much as possible, make sure that they are as dependent on our economy as possible, both on critical inputs like advanced semiconductors and other things that they cannot produce themselves today, and make sure that they remain far behind in those critical technologies. So a combination of export controls, a combination of domestic investments, a combination of, yes, even tariffs, to make sure that there's an equal playing field for our companies versus Chinese ones, is what's required to help them understand that there is a real chance that the United States might actually fight us in this conflict. which I hope we don't do. To be very clear, I don't want a war with China, but the best way to avoid a war is actually to convince your enemy that you're ready to fight one.
It seems like this is what you're kind of outlining is what a successful strategy would look like short of war. So, meaning the next administration might come in and we don't see a conflict. And then the administration says, oh, we successfully deterred them. But you could do that without having done all those things. But what you're saying, it seems like, is that you have to, of course, no conflict might occur, but you have to have all those other things in place because it's later on. Is
This is the issue with deterrence, right? Is that you never know when you have enough. So you tend to go overboard, right? We build enough missiles and counter-ballistic missiles and triad systems for deploying them and warheads to destroy the entire planet, just so that the adversaries like Russia and others are assured that should they ever launch against us, we will have plenty of capability to respond and decimate them, right? So we don't say, well, maybe half of that amount is enough, so let's just stick with that. We say, no, we're going to go overboard and have as much as we possibly can to remove any doubt from anyone that we're capable of retaliating. And we have to do the same here in the conventional sphere, is to make sure that they have no doubt that we're fully capable of defeating them and defending Taiwan, and we have the will to do so.
In your latest incarnation of your professional life at Silverado, can I ask your sense about translating these strategic concepts into policies? What are you seeing in terms of taking these concrete steps? The supply chain issue is real. People have been warning about it. And it's not just a matter of one or two things that you have to change. I mean, it goes to everything from rethinking domestic regulation, energy sources, as you said, tariffs. It opens up the shibboleth of government having perhaps to interfere with free markets by saying the free market may say the cheapest option is to buy from China, but for security reasons we don't, and we need to step in. What are you seeing in terms of the generation of the policy ideas, in essence, the bridging of the gap, right, between we've all diagnosed the problem. How do we get from here to there? What are the ideas that you see that are working? What are the ones that have legs? And are you concerned that we may have a situation where we have a spurt of enthusiasm for it and then we kind of falter? We, the United States, and again, bipartisan, the United States as a whole, not any one administration, we kind of lose that impetus and say, well, we're not interested in doing this anymore. So how are we doing in terms of translating the ideas that are being put forward into policies, and policies for deterrence to work? They also need that endurance. They need to know that this isn't something where we can be outweighted. Fine, the Americans are doing it now. We wait to 2029, 2030, 2032, they'll lose interest. How do we sustain this for the long haul?
That's a great question. So the good news is that there is a lot that's happening. The bad news is it's happening too slowly. The United States can move fast when there's an immediate crisis. When the crisis is a little bit in the future, it's very, very difficult for us to mobilize political will when we've got lots of other issues of the day happening, Iran, Venezuela, you name it. So let me take it one at a time. So there is a lot that's happening in Pentagon with regards to rebuilding our defense industrial base, right? You hear a lot about this, but now we're actually doing it. We are both focusing on existing primes and new companies with new technologies on existing primes. We're saying, you know what? We're going to give you long-term contracts so you can open up new facilities for production and you can produce the munitions that we need at scale, right? Because we had designed post-Cold War our entire defense industrial base on basically just-in-time delivery, artisanal small batch production. But of course, weapon systems are not gin, right? And small batch weapon systems is not ideal. So we need scale, and there's no reason why we can't do this, right? I've said this before. Like if we can produce 500,000 Teslas in Fremont, California, we can produce, pick a number, 10,000 Patriot missiles, interceptors. It is totally doable, and we just need to scale up production to do it. Other things like shipbuilding and these big ticket items are much, much harder. We don't have a lot of shipyards anymore. We don't have a workforce. So there's efforts taking place there to revitalize, to partner with the South Koreans and others, but that's taking much, much longer. Unfortunately, we're starting pretty deep in the hole right now there. But overall, I'm optimistic. I just hope we have enough time to rebuild it. On reducing our dependencies, there I'm actually very optimistic. And China has been a great helper to us in this, right? Last year, they used the rare earth card, probably too heavy handed and way too early to give us and everyone else in the world a sense of like, oh my God, depending on China is not great, right? And by the way, they're saying this not just about rare earths, but pharmaceuticals and other industries where they have a huge presence in. So they've really woken up the sleeping giant, if you will, both in America, but really around the world to this problem. And huge effort is going on into diversification of resources. The government is now investing directly in mining companies, never done that before. They're giving them long-term contracts for offtake to guarantee demand, so that the private sector can come in and invest in those technologies. There's discussion in the Trump administration with the G7 leaders to set a price floor for imports of critical minerals to make sure that there's long-term competitiveness for domestic industry in that. So a lot is happening on that front. Again, do we have the runway? When is she, hopefully never, but when does she decide to move forward on this? That's the big question. But we're actually now moving in the right direction. A decade ago, we were going the opposite way. And luckily now, most companies appreciate they should not be dependent on China. You have administration officials, very senior ones, telling the industry, start decoupling now, like directly. And that is all a good thing. How quickly can it all happen? We'll know, in the future.
Actually, in a related sense of learning about or from other conflicts, I wanted to get your thoughts on where and how the United States could learn in a certain sense from what's going on in the Middle East. What can we see this as an opportunity for learning, and where also kind of maybe answering this part first, where do you see the biggest risks for the United States in terms of other conflicts that we've just talked about?
Well, look, I actually think that this current conflict with Iran, I have a contrarian view on this, can actually be an amazing learning for Taiwan, and that Taiwan can be Iran. Shutting down a vital strait, really, really important for not just the world, but for their adversary, because China is hugely reliant on the Taiwan Strait, right? And can do so with relatively few resources, right? As Iran is demonstrating at the moment. So there's a lot that Taiwan should do, particularly in the area of anti-ship missiles, particularly in the area of smart mines, to make that strait and frankly all the area maritime area around their island impassable for Chinese shipping in case of a conflict, right? You want to prevent a landing, you want to prevent a lodgement, and it can do so relatively cheaply. Unfortunately, Taiwan is making the wrong decisions. Their political system is even more screwed up than ours. Very, very divided government. The current government in charge, the DPP, has the right idea. They proposed a special $40 billion budget over the next 10 years to invest in both purchases of weapon systems from the United States, but also indigenous production. The opposition, led by the KMT, that is kind of a very China-friendly party, should we say, controls that legislature and is basically saying no. They're cutting down that budget massively right now and only saying we're going to buy weapon systems from the United States that, by the way, have a long lead time for delivery because of other needs that we have. And we're going to invest in no domestic production going forward, which is dumb on several levels. One, you want resiliency. And by the way, if there's a blockade of some sort, we won't be able to resupply Taiwan. So they need to have ability to produce on their own. But unfortunately, that politics is very, very challenging right now. But I think that's one of the key lessons is how an adversary whose military has been completely decimated in this conflict, right? The Navy is at the bottom of the ocean, as the administration likes to say. Most of their defense industrial base has been destroyed. They have no air force. And yet they're still able to control a vital choke point for the entire world. And Taiwan could easily do that with a little bit of forethought and effort.
I mean, what that does suggest is something that a trend that seems to have been developing and accelerating, which is that you move to, as you said, resilient systems, decentralized, focus more on porcupine, large numbers of small, easily produced, attritable systems rather than just having a few big ticket items, and then something that you can then sustain when your industrial base is destroyed or is damaged, your power system is damaged. and so you can continue to exercise deterrence. And so,
One exception to that is ballistic missiles,
yes,
right? So a lot of focus on drones, Shahed drones. Most of the damage that Iran has been able to cause around the region, and certainly in Israel, has been ballistic missiles. So
missiles,
we cannot underestimate that. Ballistic missiles, very difficult, very expensive to intercept. Shaheds, if you have enough distance, it's actually not a problem. Not a single Shahed has been able to hit Israel because it's an 8-hour flight from Iran to Israel over a lot of territory. You can use it to that time to shoot it down. If it's just coming over the Gulf, it's a little bit harder. So the Gulf states have struggled with it somewhat. But ballistic missiles in huge quantities would be a game changer, frankly, for Taiwan, but also for Ukraine and Baltic states and other Eastern Europe, because you know how you defend Russia. I was just in Riga in Latvia late last year, meeting with their government, and they were talking about all the things that they're doing with NATO to deter an invasion from Russia. I'm looking at this brigade deployment that they're going to have, saying, "Are you kidding me? You think that's going to be a tripwire to stop Russia from rolling over the Baltics? That's not going to do it." But you know what would? 100 missiles that you could fly into Moscow and decimate Moscow and St. Petersburg in the event of war. That would really do it. And by the way, if Iran can launch that many in a salvo, as it did at the start of the war, you certainly can. So that is something that I think Western states have underplayed, and we constrain ourselves too much because there's a missile export control regime that makes it very difficult to share intelligence, to pull money together for the development of ballistic missiles. But that needs to be solved. Frankly, if Ukraine had 1,000 ballistic missiles right now, this would be a very different war.
and that's a great segue because I really wanted to touch on this question of kind of the evolution of deterrence and really what deters states from engaging in aggression, from crossing borders. And before it was, as you said, well, tripwires. Let's equip a brigade, and instead it seems that having ballistic missiles, building up your cyber capabilities, being able to harness new technologies that allow you to have that strike capability without having to build up a modern air force. Because again, as you also have noted, Iran, it's not just the Iranian Navy. Iran's not flying anything. For the most part, what we've seen in the last three years, we're not seeing dogfights over the skies of Ukraine. We're not seeing MiGs and F-16s, battling it out in the sky. This is a war of missiles, missile interceptors, and the like. So how do you think deterrence is changing, and what would be the right mix? You've already sort of given us a sense for Taiwan of, hey, Taiwan, you maybe need to think about changing your deterrence mix moving forward. What would you sort of see as kind of deterrence as we move into the mid 21st century that may look different from, and this is of something just, I have a personal and professional interest in this because of the students that I teach both at the U.S. Naval War College, but also at Harvard Extension, who are grappling with what does deterrence look like, reading all the deterrence classics of the 20th century, but then saying, all right, how much of this is relevant to the 21st century? So what, in your opinion, does deterrence for the 21st century look like?
Look, I think we've just witnessed it, and I think it's missiles. And for a long time, states thought that you need nuclear weapons for deterrence, right? In fact, what we've seen in the last, call it 4 years, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East, is that nuclear states get hit in pretty significant way. And by the way, you can go even to 9/11 with non-state actors and us getting hit, right? So nuclear weapons don't actually stop attacks on your country. In fact, an Iranian foreign minister of all people just said that about Israel, of like, hey, Israel is a nuclear power and not acknowledged nuclear power, and yet we're hitting them left and right with missiles, and it's not creating any deterrent effect for them. He's one of the sort of so-called doves in that government. He's trying to make the case that maybe we don't need a nuclear weapon to have effective deterrence. But guess what? If you have lots and lots of missiles and you need huge volumes and they're pretty accurate and you have the distance and you can put significant payloads on them, that changes the equation. In fact, the rationale for the United States to launch this war against Iran right now is that their missile program was getting too extensive. They were having too many. The range was getting extended to potentially hit Europe in a few years, maybe next decade to be able to hit Washington. Does anyone think that we would ever even consider this type of operation, either Midnight Hammer last year or this one this year, if they had missiles capable of reaching Washington or New York, even if they were just conventional with no nuclear weapons on them? I think the answer is clearly no. So enough missiles can absolutely create deterrence. Cyber doesn't actually create deterrence. Cyber is not a weapon system. It's a enabling capability. The right way to think about cyber is sort of like EW, electronic warfare, where it's really, really important, but on its own, it doesn't win you anything, right? Electronic warfare may help your planes get into an airspace that's protected by air defenses, but it doesn't actually destroy the target. You still need the bombs for that. So that's basically what cyber will help you do in warfare. And obviously, it's a phenomenal intelligence collection tool, but it's not enough. But you need to deliver the punch. You need to deliver the kinetic effect to an adversary, and to hold something that they truly value at extreme risk. And only today, really, missiles can do that. Drones, much less. Drones are easier to intercept. Cruise missiles also easier to intercept. If you have those in enough quantities, maybe you can reproduce that. The problem is particularly drones, they lack the punch. So even though Ukraine has been able to hit Moscow a bunch of times with their drones, it's really been more of a nuisance. But if they had a missile hit, let's say Red Square, that would be a totally different situation for Russia, and would certainly get their attention, right? So that becomes really, really important. And I think a lot more countries are going to be investing in missiles going forward. I think those that are on the receiving side of an aggressor like Ukraine, like Taiwan, should absolutely be doing that.
We've covered a lot of ground so far during this talk, but I wanted to close by asking you, what questions are you thinking about that policymakers should also be asking themselves that hasn't been brought up already?
Well, we haven't really talked about the Ukraine conflict, so I'll give you my prediction, and I'll caveat by saying wars are a lot easier to predict than war terminations. So I've been saying since the start of the war that this war is not going to end anytime soon. That is still my prediction. I still think that Putin is committed to winning, and he thinks that time is on his side, and that the West is getting disinterested. America is already cutting off aid to Ukraine. Who knows how long the Europeans will be able to keep funding them, at least from his perspective. That's the view. And, look, he's gaining ground virtually every month, at extreme costs, economic costs, and loss of lives, but he's gaining, right? And he thinks eventually he can get what he wants, which is Ukraine that's been completely destabilized. He grabs a bunch of its territory and is able to have ongoing political interference in that country. He may get disabused of that notion, but not anytime soon. I think this war is going to go on at least till the end of the year, probably through next winter. And then I think it depends on how badly the Russian economy is doing. If oil prices are high, he may have more time. If oil prices are low, he may start thinking about how to compromise on his original objectives and at least get to a ceasefire. The good news for him is that I think he has the full power to end it at a moment's notice, because the goals here are so nebulous, right? Denazification, demilitarization, what does that even mean? He could call it mission accomplished at any moment and say, we've done our job, we've achieved victory, however I define it. And no one in Russia will really bat an eye at this, right? I think his position and power will be completely secure, but I don't think he's ready to do that. And I think he's still clinging to this idea that of sunk costs. I spent all this effort, I spent all this money, I spent all these resources. I need to get more out of it, and I still think I can. And while he still thinks that, this will keep going.
Well, Dmitri, I'm not a gambler at all, but I'm going to Vegas next week. Do you tell me what's going to happen in Iran?
Yeah, look, I think the United States is in a pickle. We've achieved our military objectives, which, a lot of people focus on the different messaging coming out of the administration about why we did it. But the military has been very, very clear what their objectives were. The objectives were to own the skies over Iran, to destroy their air defense systems and their air power, to sink their navy, and to hit really hard their missile production and broader defense industrial base. And we did all of that, right? The problem, of course, is that it takes two to tango, and the adversary always has a move to play. And Iran's trump card for decades has been the Strait of Hormuz, right? And it's now closed. And I think that the markets and most of the people are very, very complacent to what's going on, because the oil price is around $100 a barrel, which is high, but not like outrageously high. During 2022, right after Ukraine, it was over 125. The only reason why it's this low, relatively speaking, is because we went into this year with enormous oil inventories, unusually high oil inventories. And we are drawing down at a historically unprecedented rate from those inventories. So while there's some stress in the market in terms of buying oil, it is nowhere near as bad as it would be, as disastrous as it would be if we had not have those supplies. Well, in a few weeks, those inventories are going to get to really low numbers, like probably end of the month, early June. And by the end of the summer, we're going to be in disaster territory where 150, 200, maybe even more per barrel is not out of the question. And Iran fully knows this. They're not dummies. And they know that they need to drag this out as long as possible to inflict maximum amount of pain on Donald Trump and the West. And that's why I don't think there's going to be any sort of diplomatic resolution to this. They're just dragging their feet and waiting for those inventories to be drawn down. And the only solution that I think the United States has and has had since we declared the ceasefire is unfortunately to go back to bombing. And it's not even a perfect solution because there's no certainty that even that would resolve it. But I think that if you go after their leadership targets in particular, and start to because this is the one thing we haven't actually done. Israel has gone after the leadership. We have not. We've stuck to our military objectives. But if we start going after the leadership, and we have the bunker busters that Israel does not have to head deep underground where they may be hiding, we may eventually find someone in IRGC that does not want to die. Maybe those people exist. And again, it's not a certainty and unfortunately going to cause more pain because they're going to launch more missiles, more drones across the region, hit more infrastructure. There's going to be more pain. But I think it's the only way forward that puts enough pressure on the Iranians to consider some sort of negotiated resolution, because right now they think they hold all the cards. And this blockade that we have against their oil is going to take way too long to play out. And they can sustain a lot of pain as they have for years now under pretty intense sanctions. So my prediction is that Donald Trump, he does not want to restart this war. He wants to be done with this problem, but he will realize that he has no choice but to do so. Frankly, the sooner he does it, the sooner we might end up in a resolution to this conflict. The longer he waits, the worse it gets for inventories, and oil prices will continue to climb higher. So that is my prediction, that unfortunately bombing is likely to resume, and hopefully it works. I mean, it's not a sure thing. I would even put it at less than 50% chance, unfortunately, but I don't think there's any other option, because even if we wanted to capitulate entirely and say, Iran, you get to control the strait, you can continue charging a toll for it, we're going to even pull out of the region, like, not that the administration would ever consider that, but even that wouldn't solve the problem. Because the Saudis and the UAE, the major producer in the region, would never allow their exports to go out of the Strait of Hormuz while it's being controlled by Iran. So they would be happy to see oil at $200 a barrel, $300 a barrel, exporting a fraction of their oil through pipelines to the Red Sea, making still a killing, and not exporting anything through the Strait, and the world still being in a massive shortage deficit of oil. And they would have it as leverage over us to keep us involved there. So for those reasons, I think that the only path forward is more war, unfortunately. I hate to say it, but I just don't see any other outcome here.
All right. So with that, we'd like to thank you. This was an illuminating and fascinating conversation. We touched on a lot of things here, and definitely we have a prediction checklist for conflict. And again,
and they're all verifiable.
They're all verifiable, and so we hope that we still have time. We missed the last three, but we still have time to avert the fourth, and hopefully more policymakers will grasp that opportunity rather than just letting us be carried along on the current of events. So again, thank you for joining us here at Shifting Ground, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the future.
Thank you for having me.
This has been an episode of Shifting Ground, a podcast of the Orbis Journal of World Affairs. For more information about the articles mentioned in this episode, please visit us at orbisjournal.org. Until next time.